Another module in the economics bridging program that we're taking over the summer. In this session here, we're going to look at a topic from the second module in the program, EC 4001, Economic Foundations 2. In this session, we're going to look at the whole issue of macroeconomic issues. So we'll look at issues that develop in the economy as a whole. So the key is that in macroeconomic, macro refer big. So in terms of economics, it's what happens at the level in the economy. The overall performance. Much of what is in health economics is very based on the individual farm, individual hospitals, individual illnesses, individual treatments. We can get issues that take place at the macro level. And in this run through some of those, to get familiar with the terminology that's used in macroeconomics. If you're not too familiar with it, we introduce some of the basic concepts. The key issue will be generally measuring macroeconomic performance. When are things going good, and when are things going not so good? For those familiar with the Irish economy, we'll some of the concepts around the economy, but as an illustration, you don't really need to know too much. The Irish economy, we'll just use examples as we work our way through it. If you have some readings you can look at, but at this stage I wouldn't recommend going much further into the material. As you progress through the program, you might want to come back and see I want to do a refresher on some of the issues. So there are just some references, more available in the library, some of them even online. We'll be able to track down some material that might refresh your intuitive these basic concepts. I'll be honest, for the time being though, I wouldn't get bothered about getting too deep into it, but these are just sources you can come back to if you feel necessary at some stage. Try that today is sort of something about the economy as a whole. And as we work through it, this is the first of 3 sessions I'll be taking. We'll be looking at the role of government. Government has an important role to play in the macroeconomic environment, simply because large. The behavior of individuals, of firms, etc., has a big role, but it's at that level that changes happen. Government changes quite rapidly. Most economies, governments make up maybe a third, in a larger proportion of the overall economy. So changes in government decisions have a big and sometimes immediate effect on macroeconomy. Obviously, changes for individuals and companies, but they're not as coordinated. They're all the individuals making their own minds up. When it comes to government, one decision can have huge implications. So what the government is trying to achieve with its policy, why does it make particular decisions? What outcomes is it looking for? We measure those outcomes. Whether the government policy actually succeeded. So we look at what these goals are and look at how they are measured. That's we use to measure economic policy. We'll definitely move on to the constraints that governments face. The essential for government is to make everybody better off. One of the learn as you go through economics is that things don't work out that easily. That everything costs. And for macroeconomic policy in the government side, there are certain constraints they face. They give money to one sector, they don't have that money to give somewhere else. So we look at some of the constraints facing macroeconomic policy. And as I said, we look at some issues in the Irish economy. And we're getting too easy yet. Again, it's just to illustrate how different of macroeconomic policy feed through to one economy. So the perspective in the Irish economy is the most straightforward one to use. Others are more familiar with different economies. But with the Irish situation, the key though is what's happening up here at the start. What is the government trying to achieve? How do we know whether they're achieving it? And what problems does government face trying to reach targets? So the goals of macroeconomic policy are straightforward. There are goals that the government are trying to achieve. First is to increase the standard of living, make that better off, give them a higher standard of living, a higher level of satisfaction, a higher living standard. How you want to define or measure it, just make people better off. As you want to progress, you want people to feel happier, want people to feel more comfortable, more secure. What the issue is in terms of making feel better off. An objective related to that is you want to give people the opportunity to live. So for government, low unemployment. So that if it increases standards of living, productivity, output, people involved in work is one of the best you can go in about doing that. So actually creating value, creating individuals through employment. Another target for the government, low inflation, a environment. So inflation measures price changes. Prices are changing quite rapidly, or prices are changing very erratically. It's not a very stable economic environment. So what governments do is to have low inflation. And SG, from a European perspective, take it as being rising by around 2%. So something €10 this year, it would cost €10.20 next year. So price rising at a there are African countries experience deflation, but it has many problems as high inflation. If some costs €10 this year and is expected to fall, well then next year it will cost $9.80. If I felt, well then economic activity. But deflation can be as much of a problem as inflation, where it can cost €10 now and $10.20 next year. Well, I may go ahead and buy it now. 2% is generally the target in Europe. About it is just an arbitrarily chosen number, but it's basically price stability. We don't want prices jumping erratically because it's instability and leads to people know what to do and ways to spend, maybe savings, etc. And the government is a more stable economic environment. When looking at the constraints, there are constraints that the government faces. Is it in its own accounts? What are public finances? These are the accounts of the state, the accounts of the government. How much does the government collect in tax revenue, and how much does it send out then in government expenditure? And then long run or steady state equilibrium in this can't be running excess surpluses or in Ireland excess deficits for too long, or end up in serious trouble. Now, in the Irish case, we'll see that end up because of problems in our public finances. And the second long-run constraint has to do with the country as a whole. We won't deal with this, but there is something called the balance of payments. And this basically tracks the flow of money in and out of a country. If money is leaving a country, well, then cutting down your money supply, cutting down the available money within the country. If money is entering the country, well, then the supply is increasing. The outcome in the country. So that's a payment is quite important. Balance of payments is very much related to trade, also in relation to debt and borrowings. Money is flowing in and flowing out of the country. So although the economy is in dire straits, one of the few positive indicators we have is that we are running a balance of payments surplus. More is coming into the country than out. The government are in huge deficits. Companies have stopped spending. Individuals are holding back their consumption. What we find at level in the Irish macroeconomy is that when he enters the country and leaves. That is one positive. There are huge problems, but this maintains the environment to fund itself. That we're not a borrower. That more money is coming into and coming out. As country as a whole, the government is a net borrower. Because of the actions of companies, their profits, their savings, actions of individuals, their savings, exports and imports, that we have balance of payments and surplus. So we'll just work through these in a bit more detail. The three goals of macroeconomic policy: increase the living standard of the nation, to have a low of unemployment, which I suppose is very much related, and to have low and stable rates of inflation. So how do we measure the living about doing it? That is gross domestic product. It's generally EP. So gross means total, just within the country, and means output. what's produced made. So total amount of goods and services produced within the country. Use this measure of um, the level whether the economy is improving or disimproving, country making more goods and services. So total output of goods and services produced in the country here. So data for Ireland from 2008, pretty much close peak, 181 billion worth of goods and services, or €4,115 per person. We'll look at some comparative stats in a minute. So the figures can be quite high. So we use GDP as an indicator of the well-being of society. It's not perfect, living and based entirely on the amount of goods and services it produces. No, it just gives us a good indicator. The direction of changes in GDP generally tell us what's happening to living standards. There are lots of things that GDP does not measure. In fact, there's a very famous speech by of GDP, and I'm sure available on YouTube if you search our RFK GDP speech on YouTube. It's a short 2-minute clip in watching where he highlights and shows what actually isn't included in domestic products. Things such as environment, education, the community spirit, others which make people better off, but aren't necessarily accounted for in the goods and services produced. So, but the reason we use GDP is that these other things are quite difficult to measure. How much is clean air worth, a sense of community spirit, high education amongst the population? These are quite difficult to measure. So one measure is the output of goods and services. So we use that. In general, the other measures tend to move with it. So as GDP increases, society becomes better off. It's not a perfect measure, but you use. There are other measures. If you listen to the media and look at newspapers, etc., you will see, and from an Irish perspective, the difference between them is important. But at this stage, we're not going to get into the huge technicalities of what's the difference between gross domestic products and national products. These are the two most commonly used. So the one is domestic, that's everything made within the domestic economy, and then is national. Still means simply what you live in the country get to keep. The national in a country, how much goods and services are produced, benefit, how much value accrues to individuals living within the country. And this is an important distinction because of the huge role of foreign multinational companies in the country. We have huge levels of exports from foreign companies, and they're into these companies that contribute to grow national products. They hire workers, they hire subcontractors, they cleaners, they get from lower down the supply chain from Irish suppliers. These all feed into gross national product. But these companies makes, while they contribute to GDP, they are produced in Ireland. These companies are repatriated abroad. So the wages and the subcontracts and the supplies and services, we don't get the profits. The distinction between GDP and GP, you often pick up, see that mentioned in the they tend to move together. It doesn't tend to be two substantial differences in their movement, but there's a substantial difference what they pick up. And in Ireland, GP is a larger than GNP. So the total services percent of that value actually leaves the country. Right out about the foreign multinationals, they provide huge employment. Profits do accrue abroad. The difference between GDP and GNP. What we get a measure of the standard of living in the country. So here's some figures and details from the Central Statistics Office, the body whose job it is to figures in Ireland. So GDP, GNP, and then GNP is very similar to GNP, which takes into account transfers with the European Union, which flows into and out of the country. And this table up here in the top right, we have the aggregate level. What are You can see a fairly clear pattern over the last couple of years. We can most things peaking in 2007. The boom. Irish economy was performing at its best. And then soon we see a decline through 2008, 2009, and then the preliminary figures for 2010. So the economy has been declining for the past 3 years, and declining quite rapidly, particularly early stages in 2008 and 2009. So up from nearly 190 billion GDP in 2007 to 155 billion in 2010. Hope that there's a certain sense of for 2011, but has been quite dramatic. And GNP has suffered a similar drop, 163 billion in 2007 to just 28 billion in 10. What's perhaps more important to look at is per capita per person, what goods and services produced, population basis. So this basically like the average productivity from Ireland. It gives a rough measure of average income. It's not perfect, but it gives a measure of value based on the goods and services produced in the country. The quite drops from 43,000, nearly 44,000, for GD 35,000, and GNP from nearly 38,000 down to 9,000. So quite rapid drops in a few years. Just looking on a graph, you can see the increase during the boom, and primarily the property-led boom of the 2004, 5, 6, 7 period. The calendar originally began back in the 1990s, and that was very much export-driven. The Irish economy began to expand, output began to expand, employment began to increase. The numbers of foreign multinationals entered the country, but went through a kind of a stagnation of that part of the economy throughout the 2000s. And in the latter part of the decade, up to 2007, at the peak, property-fueled boom that drove the economy forward. So much of this income output is actually construction sector. Much of this is in the construction sector. So huge of mortgages, property loans, property transactions, buying houses, which all know now was slightly artificial. We have dropped back. So at the end of 2007, the drop came, and you can see the most extent drop was in 2008. 2009, while going down, the drop has been much less severe. So the correction in the housing market is quite rapidly. It went from huge numbers of houses to very few in quite a rapid period of time. Now the construction companies stopped trading, stopped building, etc. Huge numbers of jobs, to a huge increase in male unemployment. But the worst downturn of 2008, 2009, things haven't getting any better. Things haven't been getting any worse. A certain sense of stability. But the issue is then where will we be going in the next couple of years? Will it be something that's positive, or will we scratch around here in the bottom for a while, or some doom mongers might suggest we might continue on that direction, but making ones we need a crystal ball. But a general indication of what's happening in Ireland. If we look at living standards in Ireland and people well-being and happiness and how they feel about life and their confidence, it would track this GDP, increasing confidence, increasing living standards up to 2007, and quite a significant substantial decline since then. P isn't perfect. It does a reasonable measure of what's taking place and happening in anyway. If we take a brief comparison to Ireland, so this is against the Euro area countries, so the Eurozone is going through a huge crisis zone. So where do we come looking at the Eurozone? So that is slightly dated 2005. We picked up the table from, but if you look at the GDP numbers, you can see that we're back to somewhere around 2005 levels. so maybe not completely misguided. So when we look at Ireland, so here's Ireland here, we can come to GDP. So back in 2005, it was 40,000. If you look up and down this line here, it was the second highest in the Eurozone. Luxembourg, which is a small and somewhat strange economy, dominated by the sector. On average was just under 29,000. So GDP per capita in Ireland 2005 was even more, 2% greater than the Eurozone average. That in recent years as Ireland has gone through a more severe recession. But we still would be above the Eurozone average. Again, the important thing to remember is that these are GDP figures. So this is of goods and services produced within the country. If we were GNP, national product, how much 40,000 we get to keep? Well, then we'd be much closer to the Eurozone average, because 20% GDP and GNP in Ireland. From our perspective, you can also see the importance of trade. So the gives exports of goods and services as a percentage of GDP. How large is the trading sector in your economy? And you can see 9% were beaten by Belgium, and of course, Luxembourg, which is huge financial exports, monetary amounts. So trade is quite important to the Irish economy, and it's believe that the path will be able to follow the current downturn. Some other Irish economies, well, one you can see that we're quite small. Population increased somewhat since 2005. The recent census told us the population is actually 100,000 more than we previously thought. Population is just under 4.5 million. And most of our other Eurozone partners really low population density. Most others have a far higher population density, even in countries. Germany almost times greater population density. Much larger country, but a population based on the area. So in Luxembourg, then of course is population density maybe close to times larger. The Eurozone country with a smaller population density is Finland. Huge up towards the Arctic Circle. Some distinguishing features about the Irish economy that we should take into account and contrast different countries. One about GDP that's from an economic perspective is how it changes. And this what's GDP is rising or falling. Are we boom? Are we in a recession? Are things going a bit stale? Maybe appear what's called stagnation. So it changes GDP, and the most important changes we're concerned about are real changes, where it simply means actual goods and services. GDP is a number, and it's denominated in currency, in euros. What's the value of goods and services produced in a country? So what you hear is that the GDP number could change, or the number of GDP could change, as the price changes. If we number of goods and services in 1 year and does rise, well, the GDP will increase. We won't actually be making anything extra. So they'd say 100 bicycles at 100 each with a GDP of 10,000. If the next year the 100 bicycles at €110 each, that would give a GDP of 11,000. We actually aren't any better off. All that simply happened is prices have changed. We are not any extra bicycles. So looking at changes in GDP, we will extract price changes. And what is the actual change? What are real or are we making more goods and services rather than just having a change in the value? Value is quantity by price. And we're really concerned with our changes in quantity. This means increases in actual output. price change are just changes in the number. So as GDP, if we know what it is, and a price index, we can later derive real GDP. Has the country actually made more goods and services, or is GDP just changing because prices are changing? There's an important distinction there. So change in real GDP is known as the real growth rate. And this, when people talk about the growth rate, they're referring to the real growth rate. Is the economy expanding or contracting? Is the economy making more or less goods and services? So of these growth rates referred to as the business cycle, from boom to bust. So here we have a quick representation of 3 odd years of business cycle data in Ireland. And you can see the pattern. Here it rises and even falls. To guess this business cycle, so 1980s, we had a recession. Then here is one, 1994 to 2000. This was the export-driven, out-driven, productivity-driven phase of the Celtic Tiger. Then the slowdown in 2001. The economy went through a bit of a slowdown following the tariff tax in America, and the economy recovered somewhat. And we had a nation of the boom 2003 to 2007, but the property fuel sector. This wasn't, in a sense, it was real. We were making more houses, so looking for real changes. We were making about 20,000 housing units a year to close to 80,000. So over time, increase in our housing output, but completely unsustainable. The bubble went to burst, and when it burst dramatically, dropped. GDP has been contracting now for the last years. The hope then that it will stabilize here. So when this graph is extended, when further data comes through, we can see what way it goes. But these that we get a pattern of a business cycle: expansions, contractions, booms, slowdowns, and busts. And you track different elements of it. So you have the boom, you have troughs, you have sounds, you have expansions. You have a host of different elements of the business cycle. And people start studying the business cycle to see where exactly you are. Because at a point in time, you are here, or what's going on in the future. You can't really tell what direction is going to. So people look for economic indicators to give a guide, an indication as to where the economy is actually going. So tracking the cycle is quite important. But it's important when it changes in real GDP. Is the producing more goods and services? Price can be changing. The prices aren't necessarily changes in output. And the ideas of prices are imported. Price, etc., determines a lot of inflation. So not necessarily domestically influenced. Objective and how it's measured of macroeconomic policy. That being unemployment. So the objective of the government is to have a low level of unemployment, closely related to the first one of having living standard. The person is defined as unemployed, of looking for work, but the going rate for a type of he or she is qualified to do. So 4.5 million people in Ireland, there's about 9 million people employed, but we don't classify everybody else as unemployed. Madam are in school, third level students, madam are retired, stay-at-home parents who are incapacitated. They all would not be counted in the unemployment numbers. They have a job, they're not in employment. I'm going to say they're unemployed. They're not seeking work. They have a dynamic status, either a student, a homemaker, retired person, whatever it may be. They are different categories. What we're focusing on here is employed. So then we have a subset of the population, which is the workforce. So those who are in employment in Ireland, about 8 million people, and unemployed in Ireland, 300,000. So a labour force of inner 1 million people. Back in 2008, it was over 2.2 million people. what we know over the last while is that a lot of the non-Irish nationals who came to Ireland during the boom have subsequently left. So the labour force has fallen somewhat. And you can see that the number of unemployed has increased dramatically since 2008. It's now up to around 300,000. So that change has occurred when the construction sector crashed and huge numbers of tradespeople lost employment. Track is the unemployment rate, percentage of the labour force that is out of work. Total number unemployed and divide the labour force. So you get the unemployment rate, 5, 10, 15%, whatever it may be. And tracking changes in this that gives us a measure of the labour force. So in 2009 in Ireland, it was 12.6%, which over than 8% would be a high of unemployment. And this unemployment going back 26 years. And the patterns in the unemployment rate, tracking the patterns in the GDP growth rate. The economy is expanding on falls. And as the economy goes down, unemployment rises. I can see the disaster that was the 90s. So 87, unemployment rate was 17%. One of the people of it who were looking for a job didn't have a job. For the late 80s, for people in the early 90s, we had the prolonged Celtic Tiger. Increases in employment, and then it falls in unemployment. And the unemployment rate bottomed out at around 4%. Even with a 15-year economic boom, the unemployment rate generally doesn't fall below 4%. The ritual rate of unemployment. The is expected that unemployment wouldn't fall. There are reasons as to why people are unemployed. Some people have seasonal jobs. Would be employment in the year. So we say the two sector working during the summer, the education sector working during the winter. What it might be, so people might be choosing to work at different times of the year based on the industry they're in. There are frictional issues. People are always in their jobs. In a boom, then they get a job. But you know, a lot of people moving from job to job, changing, moving around, maybe going for a job and being out of work for a couple of weeks, or go on one job and getting another job. So you have a number of people moving between jobs. And then you have structural changes. Certain parts of the economy become less and more important. So in the early there's been huge structural changes. Decline in the importance of agriculture. We had a fairly large garment industry, and as these industries decline and erode, will have structural unemployment for a period as people integrate back into other sectors of the labour force. So yes, a huge boom. We didn't really seek or look to have the employment rate falling much below 4%. So we have considered full employment. If a job has a job, and these people in the 4% are basically just moving around and will pretty quickly or can pretty quickly find a job. During the period, long-term unemployment fell quite dramatically. So we're unemployed for 12 months or more, or very, very few. There was a cohort of people who remained unemployed for 12 months or more. The vast majority of people went out and got work. And then see what happened then during 2007, 2008, started to tick upwards and surged up since then. The employment rate quickly went up to 13, 14%. So for the last around here. So you can see as high as was in the 1980s. It was higher before in Ireland. Now is, can we get it to decline again? And progress is, can we get people back to work? And it does take a long time for unemployment rate to fall. There was a 10 percentage point fall there, and that took the guts of 8 or 9 years of very, very rapid economic growth to get the unemployment rate down from 14% to 4%. So we're down from about 13%, and we're aiming to get it down around here. So it could be quite a long, drawn-out process. With the employment growth, hopefully it should sustaining. When do we get to start? Employment has been bouncing around now for a while, but it'll be declining. I'm interested to see when the growth would happen. Unemployment has several costs. It's an resource in the economy. People could be out producing goods and services. So there's lots of output and income. This several billion. From the perspective, the budgetary implications are very significant. Because we offer a fairly substantial social welfare safety net in Ireland, social welfare expenditure increases. So the Irish government is seeing substantial increases in payments for unemployment assistance and unemployment benefits. People lose employment, lose their income, particularly employed people, the employee sector. The government steps in to provide a backstop. There's also a loss of tax revenue. It's a hammy for the state. You go from where these people are contributing, paying taxes, to where they're benefiting, extracting transfer payments. The government loses on both sides, so it increases in employment, big positive consequences for the government. You reduce welfare and also increase in taxes. For the individual, there's low self-esteem leading to stress and suffering. The problems of unemployment, issues that it gives rise to. For the individual, income is by unemployment benefits, but unemployment benefit is never going to replace the income that's possible from a job. And there are well-examined links between unemployment and poverty. In terms of living standards, having a level of unemployment is one of the surefire ways of achieving increase in living standards, whereas having levels of unemployment will bring living standards down. That's what we're seeing in Ireland at the moment, with increases in unemployment over the last number of years. The objectives we look at, there should be price changes, because you can have inflation, prices rising or inflating. You can have deflation, prices falling. So inflation is a general measure of prices. So add up the amounts of goods and services. With unemployment, we just count the number of unemployed people. With inflation, it's a bit different. It's not just enough to go out and look at prices and see whether they're rising and falling. Some of them could be rising quite rapidly, but if nobody has goods anyway, it doesn't matter. So what most is a measure of price for sort of a basket of goods that people purchase. So to measure inflation, we have what's called the Consumer Price Index. So index number. So it's an index of consumer prices. So it's not measuring wholesale or retail, or sorry, wholesale or it's measuring the prices to customers. So it's the price index, collected by the Central Statistics Office. On the other side of Cork City here. They employ 200 people to collect 45,000 prices, rated close to 1,000 goods. So they're collecting prices. Shops, retailers, spread by geography, spread by supplier, collectors of goods and services throughout the country. The CSO must figure out as well, what do people buy? It's all very good saying what's in the shop and getting the price of particular goods and services. The CEO must track down what people buy. CSO carries a household budget survey, where they pay a couple of thousand households and fill out a detailed survey of their expenditure, what they spend their money on, what prices are important. If the price of good increased, will have an impact on the household. Then is presented an index with some base year set equal to 100. So where we can compare against. So some time period is said, look, the number is 100 now. If risen by 10% between now, well, the index would be 110. If prices were 20%, the index would be 120. And you get those percentage changes between two time periods. And the Consumer Price Index has been since 1922. So we have long-term data. Unemployment and like GP, we're interested in percentages. What is the percentage growth rate? What is the percentage unemployment rate? And prices, it's what is the percentage inflation rate? How quickly is it falling? inflation, well, there are certain costs. Individuals mean anticipated and expected inflation. Inflation is expected, anticipated. People can plan for it. It primarily is unexpected inflation that leads for households. Reduces the the power of money, of weight. How much can you have? €100 and start and changing. Well, you're not too bothered. You can €100 and buy the same amount of goods whenever you want. But if you have €100 and prices are rising, if you wait 6, 12, 18 months to spend your €100, rising prices, you'll get less and less goods and services. So pricing, the value of your €100 is going down in per terms. So a large portion of Irish inflation is unanticipated. Expected, it's not predicted, and what the inflation rate will be in 12, 18, 24 months' time is quite difficult. And fixed incomes are particularly affected. So wages don't change. Maybe pensioners on a new pensions where they're paid a certain amount of money each year, month or week. If there's strong and rapid inflation, it reduces their purchasing power. They're still the same euro amount every week. When they go to the shop, they're facing higher and higher prices. So the amount they can purchase falls. The next two, I just move on. Last one, of inflation is that the distribution effects that it has. It changes income from borrowers and depositors. So if a depositor, if I have money in the bank, the last thing I want to see is inflation. What I want when I take my money out, I'm able to buy the same amount of goods and services. I'm able to buy now. I want to be seeing prices falling. Or sorry, I don't want to see prices are rising. If prices are rising, the value of my money in the bank is going down. When I do come to take the money out, I bet just less and less. Whereas if I'm a borrower, if I bank money, as our society do, I want a fairly rapid inflation. I want to see wages, prices rising. Payment of my loan will stay the same. It doesn't increase because of inflation. So if you get a fairly rapid wage and price inflation, your wage, which are mortgage, stays the same. If your income and repayment gets smaller and smaller, and this is a lot of Irish people had hoped for in the boom in 2007, 2008, that economic growth it will continue, and the mortgages would be quite high at the early part of their repayment. No, this burden would fall. We actually see, of course, that this burden has risen. Income and deflation has caused a slowing of the economy, and people are larger and larger burden of mortgages. So what by the lower interest set by the government recently. So it's very important from impact on borrowers and savers. Countries take a very strong anti-inflation stance, particularly there is sort of a certain view that the hyperinflation that took place in the 1920s to the rise of and the early 1930s, the World War, to make huge reparation payments to repair their own and the other European economies, and to do these they simply printed marks, which led to huge inflation and out the incomes and wealth of the middle class. They had their money in the bank, but out of control, and they were looking for an alternative. And socialism seemed to offer an alternative. So these are a very strong anti-inflation stance, and they 2% rate of inflation, a low to moderate inflation. The inflation rate in Ireland, again, we get a distinction as to the into the 1980s. Here you can see huge inflation in the early 1980s. Inflation 20%. Pricing very rapidly. And then the inflation decreased. It was the late 1980s. and then was very stable for years of time. This is one of the features of the Irish boom, going through such a huge period of expansion with such moderate rates of inflation. A downturn came, the inflation rate fell, and it happened back up again last couple of months, and is back in positive territory. So probably a rise in about 2% per annum, which is ECB target. But it has been very volatile. We've gone from inflation 5% about 18 months and then dropped down to inflation of 6%. Now we're back up to 2%. So target average has been a bit all over the place last while. So changes are an important measure of what's happening in the economy. The last thing we look at is the policy constraints of the government, like what they do to increase standards, to increase employment, control inflation. Still constraints. So labour, when you compare it with the factors of production that are available, to the GDP. So that generally rarely had labour shortages throughout most Irish economic history. Labour surplus economy. We've had looking for work, and there is work out there. From the Irish perspective, was we had inefficient capital, instant investment. For economic history, we were very inward looking and tried to do things. The late 1950s onwards became more outward looking and tried to attract foreign direct investment. We did capital ourselves. We tried sources somewhere else. So attract foreign companies into Ireland with their investment to use our surplus labour. That we had the workers, we had the capital, and we made claims about our well-educated, highly flexible, English-speaking, highly productive workforce that attracted foreign firms and primarily attracted US firms, theatre of common language, etc. And that the increase in GDP. What happened in the midst of the boom was the labour shortage. We had workers. The unemployment rate was 4%. Simply couldn't enough people to fill jobs. And people enter Ireland, migration into the country after years of immigration, where the labour surplus, a large part would just be left the country. We face a labour shortage, and hundreds of people enter the country. That's not been really recent times. But the investment in the amount of labour, important constraints in a country. To a large, there's little the government can do about them. Little control population size, which accept it. Taking instant capital, there is government investment, can make the country more attractive for foreign investment, but they are dependent on individual decisions. So really important have a role to play. Financial constraints. So how important financial constraints? The fiscal deficit, fiscal accounts, and then the payments, sort of our the rest of the world. So deficit. The difference between government revenue and government expenditure. How much collect in taxes, and how much send out in expenditure. Government deficit is the gap between those. And then you have a national debt. If you run continual deficits, the debt builds up. And the debt is governments accumulate foreign or external debt, borrow the country. And the most Irish government debt are the country, lead to an outflow of interest, which would appear to balance the payments. But even though we have large government debt, the outflow of payments is by the inflow of other funds, investments from abroad, etc., imports and exports. Now, interest rate payments can account for a large portion of income tax revenue. We expect government expenditure to be going providing goods and services, social welfare, health, education, building infrastructure, etc. The government has a large debt. A lot of tax revenue can actually just go to pay the interest on the debt. The increase in Ireland over the last number of years, and expected that by 2014, government payments make up 20% of government revenue. And this is fairly similar to the situation we had in the 1990s. So €5 collected in tax by the government will go to pay people the Irish government has borrowed from. So it won't go to goods and services, it'll provide interest liabilities. The impact of this is that it forces government to reduce debt with the impact of unemployment. So we said that the goal of economic policy of the government would increase living standards, low unemployment, etc. But sometimes the government accounts themselves become the target. And we've got to the situation now where the government accounts are so out of that to a extent the increase in living standards is the objective. You just want to get through this medium-term pain or get government accounts back on track and then get on to concerning themselves with the primary goals of economic policy. So if you look at the balance in Ireland, we can up until we generally rent surpluses each every year. They weren't huge surpluses, huge money flowing into government coffers, but we managed to spend the whole pile of it. And what we're at now in 2008, 2009, 2011, we're on huge deficits. You can see quickly the deficit 3 or 4 years will eat away and cancel the surplus up previous 10, 12 years. So the accumulated during the good times actually quite small. We managed to spend most of it, and now we have needs and the accounts completely out of whack. We don't have the reserves that meet these deficits, so we wouldn't borrow the money. There's tax and spending over the boom years. You tax rolls, these lines here, really increase spending. You have more and more money from tax revenue. But when downturn came, we were able to put the brakes on spending, continued to rise. So during 2008, 2009, 2010, spending has continued to rise. There have been cut spending recently, but with increases in unemployment, no further cuts in the public sector, increase in interest expenditure, the gap in tax revenue has fallen quite dramatically. And most of the revenue is related to the market. Government collecting huge amounts of stamp duty, of houses, billions upon billions upon billions. Income from the workers in the construction sector, VAT from the sale of new houses, VAT from the sale of materials and building supplies. These all dried up pretty quickly. Huge gap now in Ireland and government revenue. And this gap will be about 18 billion. So a gap. The shortfall has to be funded from somewhere. So the government have a reserve itself, so we have to borrow it. Recently, up last November, we were able to borrow it from private markets. We could just go to people excess funds, savers, the money. But we've been from those markets since last November. And we have the money from the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. But the Irish government would not be continued to be able to operate. So the Ireland faces over the next couple of years is we narrow that gap. What do we do? Do we inflation? Do we expenditure? Or is it inflation in the boat? So we do it by 2015. This gap back under control. And you can see that there's a gap we still have a long way to go. And the problems of these huge deficits is that it's leading to a ballooning national debt. National is rising and rising quite dramatically. This has continued upwards at a huge accelerated rate. During the boom, the debt hardly moved. This was the debt from the 1980s. It didn't pay off. It just sort of left it there. It was fairly low interest rate. It didn't really make a difference. But over the 3-4 years, which added about 50 into the debt, and then these ongoing deficits, the fact that the government spends more money than it takes in, that has added 100 billion to the debt. We've got debts of about 30 billion up to this year to be 170 billion. So quite quickly. So 50 of that is due to the banks, and 100 billion is due to government expenditure, transfer payments on unemployment, pensions, benefit, etc. Very substantial, and paying public sector workers. there could be more cuts. Don't tell my colleagues are elements that the government spends money on, and interest is also leading to it. So the picture from Ireland at the moment is not pretty. Well, we look at it, we just have 5 minutes to go. We'll take all that because it's usually important. Is the payments? It's not usually important for somebody to just get an taste of macroeconomics. We just know that it's there. So the payments is a record of economic transactions with the rest of the world. Is there more in or flowing to the country? Makers must avoid payments deficits. So from this perspective, we're very open to change. And we have a balance of trade surplus. We export far more than we come in, or than we import. Monthly data, I believe. So you can see that during the initial Celtic Tiger, the balance was increasing, and this happens during Celtic Tiger phase 2. As the economy expanded, the balance did it kind of silently. It wasn't kept much of an eye on. As the economy was expanding, it was believed that things was quite well. For 2002 to 2006-07 period, the balance began to decline. So the export sector wasn't as strong as it had been in the previous Celtic Tiger sector. Around 2008, when we actually went into free fall, when we needed it to step in, the balance actually had started to grow again. €3.5 billion a month. There is entering the country, then leaving the country. Okay, that is going to the foreign multinationals, but only coming into the country. Then this goes to pay the wages, the supplies, the contractors in the foreign national sector. So that is a strong benefit from the multinational sector. So if you look at the balance of payments, this is CSO data. We could get more data, but merchandise or trade, we see positive numbers. Billions of billions extra entering the country. In Serbia, we run a deficit. Income is the profits of the multinationals leaving the country. And you can see that these are quite substantial. They clear out of here every year. Transfers are mainly with the EU, charitable givings from Ireland. And we have the balance on the balance of payments. And recently it was negative. And as I said, as an indicator in the Irish economy, in the last couple of years it has turned positive. More through trade, through services, or perhaps just taking less out, is entering Ireland and is leaving. While Ireland has huge problems, we're not going to go insolvent. There's more money coming in than going out. 8 minutes, not a bad little run through. Some macroeconomic issues. At this stage, let's focus on the lingo, the different words, GDP, unemployment, inflation, how we measure them, what the different changes mean. I'm just not familiar with that. I wouldn't be going into it in any more great detail than that. As I said, there are some readings that you can look at, but I'll come back to those later in the year. The stage is just to know what an economist means when they refer to inflation or unemployment or economic growth, what they're actually talking about. Understand what's happening. If you have any issues or problems, you can email at fas@ucc.ie. I think go way back 58 minutes ago I didn't introduce myself. I am Coffee, even though it's Aaron Crowley over there as the host, I'm just using his login into this. Fairly used to them. So at Coffee, UCC.ie, if you have any questions on macroeconomic issues. We have 2 more of these to go over the next day or 2. We have one on prevention, so looking at what governments can actually do about some of these objectives they have. How can they change economic performance? And then we'll ask macroeconomics and health, some issues in terms of the overall economy and the healthcare sector. It's me, Sam, from Macroeconomic Issues. I hope it was a useful session. So if you have any queries, you can get back to me, and I will talk to you over the next while. Thanks.